Welcome. My name is Rick Garfunkel. I'm the Vice President for Global Affairs at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. Much of the world has been made increasingly aware of the plight of refugees this past year, mainly because of the extensive media coverage of the large number of people fleeing civil unrest in Afghanistan and the war in Ukraine. But as most of you know, over the past decade, there's been mass displacement in many places, including Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. For today's event, we have put together a series of panels which will discuss where we are from various angles, and especially within the US, in terms of our support for refugees. The panelists are experts, many of whom have been involved in practical support programs for years. One of the goals for today's event is to reflect on how we might build on best practices and create more sustainable ways in which higher education can have a positive impact on the predicament of refugees, focusing for the most part on student and scholar refugees. I would especially like to thank Anu Gupta, Assistant Dean for International Academic Support at Rutgers Global, for bringing this event to life in record time. Anu herself also has extensive experience in working with the UN and NGOs. Now let me introduce Rutgers University's president for some introductory remarks. Jonathan Holloway was appointed president of Rutgers in 2020. He's an eminent historian specializing in post-emancipation US history with a focus on social and intellectual history. Dr. Holloway is author of several books, most recently, The Cause of Freedom, A Concise History of African Americans, published this past year. He earned his bachelor's degree with honors in American Studies from Stanford and a PhD in history from Yale. Dr. Holloway serves on several boards, including the Andrew Mellon Foundation and the Smithsonian's National Museum for African American History and Culture, and he is a fellow of the Council of Foreign Relations. Dr. Holloway himself has been quite engaged over the past year on the topic of today's event. It was actually he who introduced me last July to help move at-risk women leaders in Afghanistan and their families to safety. And I see in the room today, we have Soraya Pakzad, Shala Farid, and several other at-risk women experts from Afghanistan, as well as from other locations. Please welcome Rutgers' 21st president, Jonathan Holloway. Jonathan.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And one important piece of information for this meeting is that I have the honor of serving as a trustee for the Institute for International Education, IIE. Alan Goodman, I know, is on the Zoom as well. And so I take great pride in being part of that organization, especially pertinent to our conversation today. For those new to Rutgers, we are a community of 70,000 students and another 30,000 faculty and staff with a mission of teaching, research, and service to the state and the broader world. We truly are the State University of New Jersey, with campuses from the north end of New Jersey to the south end. We take seriously our role as a public university. Access and opportunity for us is paramount. We are committed to extend opportunities to first-generation, low-income, and historically underrepresented students. Indeed, the democratic possibilities of a place like Rutgers are the very things that compelled me to put my name in the hat in the first place. New Jersey has been a home for new people, a new home for people from all around the world. And as a state university, we try to reflect that hospitality. So it makes perfect sense then that a university like Rutgers would welcome in the displaced and the refugee. A relatively recent precedent is guiding here. During the 1956 Hungarian uprising, 200,000 people fled the country to escape communist rule, and 32,000 of them came through Camp Kilmer, which is now part of our Livingston campus in New Brunswick, New Jersey. A Rutgers graduate led that project, and Rutgers people and the university helped those refugees in various ways. This year, we have worked to support Afghan and Ukrainian refugee students and scholars. Our Rutgers Global Office led efforts to help several dozen find their way out of very high-risk locations. We brought some of them to Rutgers. We're thrilled to have them as part of our family. We've also supported current students, faculty, and staff from regions affected by the conflicts. Let's step back to consider the broader picture here. Humans have migrated for one reason or another throughout history: in search of food in time of famine, in search of safety to escape natural disaster or war, in search of freedom from political oppression, in search of work in time of economic hardship. They migrate in the hope of finding a safer and more hospitable situation. This nation, remember, is in part a story of immigrants and refugees. As we have seen climate catastrophes in recent years around the world, we can expect to see more displacement in the decades ahead. So where do universities fit into the response to this displacement, especially the immediate reality of refugees from Ukraine and Afghanistan? I believe deeply that access to education and research can be a route to personal and social well-being. It can be a path to progress and a sense of normalcy. And as communities dedicated to the common good, we at Rutgers naturally want to help. But what are the best ways to do that? I think we should consider a holistic response. We should support displaced academic faculty, like many institutions. We work closely with IIE for many years to host refugee scholars. We should include a modification to admissions practices to bring refugee students to campus. We should create a supportive environment for refugee students and scholars. We should engage with the wider community, including resettlement agencies and employers. We should find ways to support students and scholars stuck outside the US, working with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, partner universities, and other organizations abroad. We should research issues surrounding displaced people to identify appropriate interventions. As we seek to do all these things, we recognize, we recognize that it will require tapping limited resources, both institutional and financial, to make this work. And universities can support these refugees best when we work in coordination with other agencies and organizations. It's not just one institution trying to improve the atmosphere and the quality of life for these people. It's one institution working in collaboration with others to pull that together. Today's discussion is about finding that ideal role for higher education and helping the displaced and the refugee. How can and should higher educational institutions engage? Should it be at the campus, national, or international level, or all three? We're deeply grateful to have some outstanding experts with us today who have been devoted to these issues. As we think about the long-term solution, the sustainable solution to supporting displaced and refugee students and scholars, and perhaps even minimize displacement, we know it's going to take a team effort. So my personal thanks to everyone who's engaging in this conversation, from government, from the UN, from foundations and NGOs, and from higher education. This is a critical discussion, and I'm quite proud that we're having it today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for your commitment to this incredibly important issue, and thank you all for your dedication.
Thank you very much, President Holloway. We're going to move directly on to the speakers. We have a rather packed program today. So thank you again. If there's any questions, we'll get them to President Holloway through email or through other channels afterwards. Let's move on to the first panel, which will be a series, the first speaker of which is Rosie Hughes. Actually, before that, let me ask Anu Gupta to give a little bit of a background on today's activities. Anu?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rick, and thank you, President Holloway, for your very inspirational remarks. I thought I would just take you very quickly through the agenda today. You've all received it when you registered, but Flora, if you can move to the next slide, please. So we are going to be beginning with the first panel, which is the global understanding of displacement, when we have wonderful speakers there from UNHCR, IIE, and from Georgetown University, followed by federal response to refugees and humanitarian crisis, where we're going to have Department of Homeland Security and the State Department, and the moderator is from the American Council on Education. Then the third panel is promoting access to opportunity. We all know the importance of resource mobilization, both monetary and otherwise, that are needed to actually achieve some of the goals that we've talked about today. which is how does higher education play a larger role as the crises, global crises, refugee crisis increase. We are then going to go ahead and have some of the universities talk about their real-time experiences as they pivoted, right, these past 2 years in responding to crises both in Afghanistan and Ukraine. And we will end with the most important panel, perhaps in some ways, because in really looking at recommendations and solutions. And there we have the President's Alliance on Higher Education Council, NAFSA, and also President Kyle Farmby from Guilford College, who are going to make some recommendations on how we might work together. We are hoping that this is just not just an event, that we are all going to regroup after this event, and we are going to find creative ways to keep working together. So with that, I am going to hand off to Vice President Garfunkel to be the moderator and kick off our first panel on global understanding of displacement.
Thank you very much, Anu. Okay, let's get right to it. The first speaker will be Rosie Hughes. She is a refugee education pathways expert at the UN Refugee Agency. That's the UNHCR at their office in Washington, D.C. She has worked for humanitarian aid organizations, including UNHCR, in multiple countries in Asia and Africa, and as a journalist in France and in her home state of Maine, where I believe she is today. Rosie, all yours.
Thank you so much. And thanks to Rutgers Global for the invitation. Can you all hear me?
Yes, all good.
All right. Well, it's a really true honor to be here. And I have to say I was moved by President Holloway's opening, compelling and strong opening remarks. It'll be a tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. I'm going to just share my screen now. I have a few slides to share. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Okay, so before I move to that one, so I've been asked to today sort of frame the global challenges that we'll be discussing here today, and in doing so, I'm going to touch on ways that the U.S. higher ed community can contribute to solutions, because there's an opportunity here as well. It's not all just challenges. And I'm going to keep my remarks intentionally very broad. And then my colleagues, Alan and Susan, are going to zoom in and provide more details and nuance in their remarks. So moving to the next slide. Since today's audience, I understand, is quite large and includes a mix, people from a mix of backgrounds, I've been asked to first explain what a refugee is and what my organization, the UN Refugee Agency, or UNHCR, does. And to answer those questions, I'm going to play a really brief 1-minute video that I think covers these questions more clearly than I could myself. So hopefully this will work. All right. So I just wanted to elaborate on 2 points that the video mentioned. And first is that number, 25 million, that was cited in the video is a little bit dated. It's from 2019. Unfortunately, by mid-2021, which is the last time that data was released, the 25 million had risen to over 26 million. And that figure, 26 million figure, doesn't include Afghans forced to flee starting last August or the over 5 million Ukrainians who have fled their homes just this year. The second point I wanted to make is that while UNHCR's core mission is to assist refugees, so people who have been forced to flee their home country, we also work with other similar groups. So for example, stateless people who don't have a country, and with internally displaced people who fled home but remained inside the borders of their country. Now I'm going to move on to present I'm going to focus on two big global challenges that we're seeking to address. How do I go to the next slide? Okay, there we go. And the first is that, as many of all of you know, I'm sure, we're living in a time of really record forced displacement. As this slide shows, forced displacement has doubled from 2010 to 2020. And by the end of 2020, more than 82 million people were forcibly displaced by conflict, persecution, violence, and human rights violations. And that's 1% of all of humanity. And just to note that 82 million figure is so much higher than the 26 million that I spoke about in the last slide, because the 82 million includes a more than officially recognized refugees. It also includes internally displaced people, stateless people, and asylum seekers who don't yet have formal refugee status. And as I mentioned before, this data doesn't yet incorporate newly displaced Afghans or Ukrainians, and new data that will include those recent displacements will be released in June. And I also just want to note, speaking of these global figures, that the vast majority, so 86% of all forcibly displaced people are being hosted in developing countries. And fewer than 1% can access resettlement in a developed country like the United States. And as many of you know, I'm sure, President Biden has set a goal of admitting 125,000 refugees to the United States this year. But we're unlikely to get anywhere near that number, in part because the administration needs to build back the resettlement program that the previous administration had dismantled, which is, of course, no small task. And then finally, before moving on, I just wanted to point out that while emergent situations like Afghanistan and Ukraine are, of course, devastating, tragic, and certainly capture headlines, I should note that most refugees, almost 80% and a growing percentage, are in protracted situations. And this means that they've been in exile for more than 5 years and many for decades. Though they're usually quite far from the spotlight, their needs are no less real. Moving on, the second challenge I want to put on the table for us today is that refugees lack equitable access to higher education. As you can see on this chart, today just 5% of refugees of college age can access higher ed around the world. For the general population, that figure is 37%. The barriers to higher ed access for refugees are immense, and I'm not going to go into them here, since that alone could take up hours. But they include things like limited access to knowledge of opportunities, testing centers, complete transcripts, the internet access, travel documents, funding, visas, and on and on. We don't have great data on how many refugees manage to come to the US for higher ed because it's not collected. But the closest data that I'm aware of, it's sort of approximate, comes from a study done by OECD and UNHCR. And Flora might be able to drop that into the chat for those who are interested. And this study suggests that maybe a few thousand refugees come to the US as students each year. And that's less, quite a bit less than 1% of the million international students studying in the US annually. I would say it's tiny compared to the potential. So next slide. So what are we, UNHCR and partners around the world, doing to address these two massive challenges? Quite a bit, but for the sake of time, in just a couple minutes and a couple slides, I'm going to focus on two areas that our organization has made a strategic priority. And the first is that we're prioritizing identifying and supporting what we call durable solutions that enable refugees to rebuild their lives. Often, as this photo illustrates, this involves helping people find a new home and ultimately citizenship in a safe third country. So not in their home country where they can't return to, and not in the country where they first sought asylum, but in a third country like the United States or Canada or somewhere in Europe, for example. And we traditionally have done that through government resettlement programs. But as I mentioned before, fewer than 1% of refugees can access resettlement. And as we've seen in this country, resettlement can be politicized and programs can be dismantled overnight. So since 2018, which is when this big international agreement many of you surely know about, called the Global Compact on Refugees, was signed, we've been broadening our work on helping refugees find permanent solutions in developed countries and broadening the actors that we work with. This problem is so massive that we need the whole of society involved, not just governments, not just the UN, not just NGOs. We need all of us involved. And in that respect, we're working with partners around the world to identify and expand other pathways to safety outside of and in addition to traditional government-run resettlement programs. Our main focus there is on 3 types of pathways. First, labor. Second, family reunification programs. And third, and relevant to our conversations today, is study programs, where refugees gain admission to a third country through a higher ed program. And that's a good segue to the next slide. This work on durable solutions that I was just talking about intersects with another ambitious goal and strategic priority, which is that 15% of refugee youth access higher education by 2030. We call that our 15 by 30 target for short. And that would be up from the 5% that I mentioned before. And this is a relatively new priority for UNHCR. Among other things, the Syrian crisis, in which suddenly hundreds of thousands of young people with higher education ambitions were forced out of their country, I think helped us and others see that higher ed is not a luxury in humanitarian situations. It's life-changing and sometimes also life-saving. And it can have ripple effects on families, campuses, and societies. So since we started prioritizing higher ed access less than a decade ago, we've made some progress. At the time when we started, just 1% of refugees had access to higher ed. Now 5% do. And as I said, we aim to get to 15% by 2030. 15% represents 500,000 young refugee women and men who we want to see enrolled in higher ed in 2030. And we're working on several fronts to get there, including supporting connected learning programs that bring higher ed to refugee camps and other settings virtually. We're also expanding DAFI, which is UNHCR's flagship scholarship program for refugees to study in their country of asylum. And importantly, we're seeking to develop more education pathways. So opportunities for refugees to move to study in developed countries like the United States, and then hopefully stay and find a permanent home. Finally, I want to emphasize in all of this work the crucial role of partnerships, and especially with higher ed institutions to meet this goal. UNHCR doesn't have a lot of expertise or experience in higher ed. We're relatively new to working in this area in a serious way. So we need partners like you, and I'm speaking to the higher ed folks in the virtual room. We need partners like you in this work. And I'll just sort of as a last note, say that I think we from the headquarters level throughout see significant potential for the US higher education community to really lead in this realm, to welcome more refugees to your campuses and to extend your remote programming to refugees overseas. We need more of both types of interventions. We've been really heartened by the growing interest and response to these challenges from campuses across the country. I think this gathering is a great testament to that. I know that some of the speakers in future panels will be talking in more detail about what's been happening in this space and what needs to continue, what's needed to continue moving the needle forward. So I'll leave that to them. And I'll just end by thanking you again for the opportunity to speak with all of you. And here's my email if you want to reach out with ideas or questions. I would love to connect with anyone really interested in seeing what we can do to help more refugees, students find safety and reach their potential through US higher ed. I really believe that we can all stand to gain from this work. So thank you.
Thank you, Rosie, for a very excellent big picture presentation of where the world is right now in terms of refugees. Next speaker will be Alan Goodman. In the slim chance that you don't know, Alan is the CEO of the Institute for International Education. IIE is an organization that promotes the exchange of scholars and students, rescues scholars, students, and artists from persecution, displacement, and crises. conducts research on international academic mobility, and administers dozens of critical programs, including, for example, the Fulbright program sponsored by the U.S. Department of State. Alan?
Rick, thank you, and thanks very much to Rutgers Global for convening us and for lending us their president to serve on our board. Jonathan's services very much appreciated, as well as his remarks this morning, reminding us that this mission has to be part of the institutional DNA. And I get it. A lot of people are afraid of figuring out how to help refugees and displaced people. But we do have 25,000 institutions of higher ed around the world, many where refugees are, authorized to take international students. And our message to each of them is each one take one. Take a refugee or displaced student, take a threatened scholar, because that's the only way we can begin to get the experience and also to address the problem at scale. We actually, we're afraid to help refugees, and especially afraid to help disconnected students, because if they've been disconnected for 1, 2, 5, 7, 10 years, there's no guarantee that suddenly being back on a campus, suddenly enrolling in a course, they're going to thrive. And I think it's natural for higher ed institutions, maybe especially in America, to think that this is going to be a very hard adjustment period. I'm here to tell you that it's not. We are so overwhelmed by the resilience of refugee and displaced students when they reconnect to higher ed. Doesn't matter if they've been out 5 years or 7 years or had a child in between. Because when they get back to campus, when they get back into the degree program, they excel. They also, our experience is, if your campus has community service and community service opportunities, they're the first to go out and collect money for the Haitian earthquake victims. They're the first to try to help people caught in the Ethiopian civil war. And we saw this time and time again with the refugees we started helping in Jordan, from Syria, and now around the world. We have a scholarship program called Odyssey, which attempts to fund a full education for refugee students at the undergraduate or graduate level. We're engaged in a campaign to raise $100 million to make that a permanent feature of higher education, and to provide the education where the refugee is. To provide it in the university near the camp or near the city where so many displaced are. Because we find that often the opportunity to be a student reconnected is in another continent. And refugee and displaced people don't have papers, they don't have the ease of travel. And most of all, we don't want a lot of people to travel to a place from which they can never get back to their home community to help. Because they will be the leaders of this next generation, and they will discover the solutions to the staggering numbers that Rosie was talking about, numbers which will only grow. So one problem we face is getting over our fear. And there's now a lot of experience to say, as Rutgers has, if you start taking them, they become leaders on your campus and terrific students and terrific scholars and terrific researchers. Another is the problem of visas, and we don't have a Nansen system like the world had before World War, after World War I and before World War II. We don't have an easy way for threatened students and scholars to move from one place to an opportunity in another. In 2008, Senator Patrick Leahy did succeed in amending the Immigration Reform Act of that year. It did not pass the act itself, but he inserted in the act that the Secretary of State must issue not less than 5,000 visas to threatened scholars annually. And when I saw that, I called him because I was quite worried. I wasn't sure we could find 5,000 threatened scholars in 2008. And he said, don't worry, there will be plenty of business. And it turned out that he's right. We need that kind of a system more than ever so that refugees that get the opportunity, displaced people that can get the opportunity, have a means and a way to travel to the countries that have the opportunity for them. I also understand the importance, as Jonathan said, of mission. This is a new mission for most higher ed institutions. If you think about the history of higher ed, for the first half of the 20th century, enrollments in tertiary education were quite low, maybe 3 to 5%, even in the advanced countries. So when there were displaced and refugee people in the college age cohort, most of them actually weren't going to college. And universities really didn't see that they had an opportunity or a mission or a need to address that problem. After World War II in the 1950s, there were refugee camps. But unlike what we have today that Rosie mentioned, those refugee camps went away in 3, 4, 5 years. They've not been around for 20 years like they are today. So we are only recently coming into our own, realizing that this age cohort in refugee camps, in displaced situations, started higher education somewhere and needs to finish it somewhere else. The UN itself didn't recognize that education, higher education, was part of humanitarian aid until 2016. And as far as I can tell, in the last century, only one university in the whole world created a graduate faculty in exile. That was the New School in New York City. And one university in Europe created a graduate faculty for the European Humanities Institution. If you think about it, that's 100 years, 2 universities in exile, when the world probably needs 190 universities in exile. And I think this is something that the Open Society University Network, now in formation, is trying to address. But again, it underscores that this is not natural often for universities to undertake. But it needs to now be part of the mission, because we need to be part of the solution that the UN is seeking, that all of us on this call, I think, are seeking. And we have the power to solve through education. If each one takes one, we have the power to solve the beginning of addressing the problem at scale. Rick, I want to thank you, and Rutgers especially. I don't think there's been a crisis in the past 3 years that you haven't been the first call that I've gotten and said, how can we help? It like you read the newspaper in the morning and call me before 9 and say, we're here to help, we'd like to help. And we really appreciate you and it and what everyone on this call is now trying to do. It is a way we can help make the world a less dangerous place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. It takes a village, as we all know. Let's move on to the next speaker to try to stay on time, and then we'll have a couple of minutes left for Q&A. And I remind you all, feel free to put your questions in Q&A, short and long, and we'll try to condense them a little bit. Next speaker is Susan Martin. She's the Donald Herzberg Professor Emerita of Migration in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. She is an alumna of Douglas College, which is part of Rutgers, and serves on the Dean's Advisory Board there. She's taught courses on women and displacement in the Department of Women and Gender and Sexual Studies here at Rutgers. And she's been very engaged over the years in a wide range of issues related to displacement. Susan, please.
Thank you, Rick. And it's delightful to be back in the Rutgers event. Only sorry that it's virtual and not in person. And really want to extend my thanks also to Rick and others at Rutgers for the marvelous work that you're doing, not only in bringing this issue to attention, but taking concrete action. I thought that I would expand a bit on what Rosie said in terms of some of the global trends in displacement today, and link them to the issues that we're discussing in terms of the role of higher education. And I wanted to just, very quickly, even before I get into that, add a couple of dimensions to the problem that I think we sort of touched on, but haven't yet gotten into a lot of detail that go beyond bringing students to the US or other countries for education. But as part of what Alan was saying, also bringing education to the refugees and displaced persons where they are, various different programs. And the Jesuit network of universities has had a program for many years now that offers a bachelor's degree to refugees who are still in place. So it's really bringing education to them. And I think it's an interesting concept that deserves more attention in terms of how to deal with it. Another issue that I've worked on myself quite a lot is the fact that most universities in the US and Europe, Canada, et cetera, have students who are foreign students in other countries at times that crises break out. And an important role is also of a university is also getting our own scholars and students back home and reintegrated into our educational systems. So I think over time, there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed beyond the very important ones being talked about in this context. I opened my presentation in terms of the overall trends just as a reminder that the US has been resettling refugees and displaced persons since just immediately after World War II, after having had terrible refugee policies in the 1930s, which prevented their entry. And I think it's always important to remember that these programs are in effect relatively new, even if we've been a country of refugees for all of our history. Just again, as a reminder from what Rosie talked about, there are three different concepts that I would look at, as well as a fourth one, and that's that internally displaced persons. Many are in situations which are very, very similar to those of refugees, but they have not yet crossed an international border. As the other type of internal displacement is also from natural or man-made disasters that are expected to cause even greater displacement in the years ahead. Then there are the refugees who are the main focus of attention right now here, and those who have fled because of violence, conflict, or fear of persecution. And they can't get protection from their own countries or return there. And so they remain outside of their countries. And then the migrants who have left their homes to live and work elsewhere. Most scholars, though, of migration see this as a continuum between voluntary and forced migration, because many people have overlapping drivers in terms of their movement. They may have be leaving because they fear violence or conflict, but they may be choosing to arrive in another country because they have family there or because they're seeking better situations for their families. And then, of course, there's the asylum seeker who has not yet been recognized as a refugee, but may have very particular needs that must be addressed. These are, again, a little bit more detail about the 82 million people that were forcibly displaced at the end of 2020. There are, of course, many more now because of both Afghanistan and Ukraine. About 20 million of them are directly under the mandate of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. There are another almost 6 million who are Palestinian refugees who are under the mandate of another UN agency, the UN Relief and Works Administration. There are about 4 million Venezuelans who are displaced abroad. In many of the South American countries that have taken Venezuelans have not tried to put them through a formal refugee status determination, but have admitted them in what is more like the temporary protected status that the U.S. affords to people who are already in the U.S. but could be doing more in terms of helping people get into the country. The 4 million asylum seekers, and the largest portion, about half of the or more of the of any given time of those who are displaced are internally displaced. And again, they have very, very similar needs. And I hope as we move forward in the discussions, we don't limit it to just what can be done for refugees who are fortunate enough to be in safe places elsewhere, but also talk about how perhaps more internally displaced persons can also have access to education abroad or education at home, and what we can be doing for another category of people that don't show up in these figures, but those are the people who are trapped in place, who are, in the basements that we're seeing now in Ukraine, of people who can't get out because they don't have the means by which they can depart. In terms of the trends, as the numbers indicated that, the displacement has increased quite significantly over the last 10 years or so. The number of refugees has increased quite dramatically during this period, but they're really back to the 1980s and 90s level. So we're not seeing that earlier period of time in which many more refugees were coming out and also were being resettled to places like the United States. The demographics of refugees now show a relatively similar balance in terms of gender. It used to be that women-headed households tended to dominate, and we were seeing a much higher proportion of adult women coming out. I would predict that in the next set of statistics we have that include Ukraine, that will be back into that, because if anybody has been watching the news today on Ukraine, many of those who have become refugees are women and children, because the men are expected to remain and under law are required to remain in Ukraine and help with the military actions that are taking place. I want to point to the bottom two set of statistics because they help explain why this is such a problem and a growing problem in terms of protracted displacement. And that's that out of the 80 plus million people who are displaced, only about 3.4 million have been able to either repatriate if they're refugees or return to their home communities if they're IDPs. The vast majority are in a protected situation. And the other thing that's quite disturbing is how few refugees are being resettled now, and these are figures from UNHCR, of relatively few cases being submitted for resettlement because there are so few resettlement slots. If we compare that to 1980, where the US was submitting 14,000 refugees per month, not per year. And we can see just how limited resettlement has become and how great a need there is to reinvigorate it, not just in the US, but elsewhere. Now, saying a few more things about refugees as a distinct group, and this is from my own picture from the refugee camp in Isata in the far region in Cambodia and Ethiopia, in which the conditions are quite difficult, and in some respects have been getting worse over time. But this slide shows the forced displacement situations. On the left-hand side are the numbers by country of origin. Again, Ukraine will be up at the top. Afghanistan has always been close to the top, and we're at the top and will be even more so in the data for 2021, 2022. But Syria remained the largest with about 6.8 million people displaced both internally and internationally, far more displaced. And this is just showing the refugees, not the internally displaced people. I'll have other slides on that. But then in the other slide, the other graphic is on by host country. And Turkey at that time was way up there. Poland would be there in this coming set of statistics when it starts to reflect Ukraine, but we also have quite a lot of Venezuelans and Colombia added on, as you'll see, to the numbers of internally displaced persons who are there. Germany and the US are the only wealthy countries in this list on that, and that's partly refugees, but a lot is asylum seekers.
Thank you, Susan. I think we will have to.
Okay, can I just show let me go to my last slide, because I wanted to show with the larger group of priorities than Rosie did of things to be done. The last three areas are ones where we should be thinking about education in terms of greater protection of rights and security, also greater resilience for those who continue to be displaced, and also a mechanism for durable and transitional solutions for people who want to. So taking all of these numbers, it comes down to what the priorities need to be as they relate to education.
Thank you very much, Susan. Okay, we have 5 minutes for Q&A if we try to stay on schedule. And I apologize for packing so much into the day's event today. Too many excellent speakers, not enough time as usual. If nothing else, you will learn who are the leaders, national leaders, and in some cases, international leaders in the field, and you can reach out to them separately. First question, I guess, for Rosie. What are, from your perspective, the current largest barriers for refugees coming to study in the US, especially refugee students and scholars?
Sure, thanks. I'll try to keep it brief. We could talk about this for hours. I think some of them have been identified already. I'll just briefly sort of identify three primary ones. There are plenty of others. First would be the overseas access piece. As anyone here who has been to college in the US knows, the application process is daunting and complex, even for Americans to navigate. And right now there's very little infrastructure to help refugees with this process overseas. Those who are admitted from overseas typically have had some help from family who was maybe already in the US or gotten support from one of the few college access programs that work with refugee populations. The second big one, which President Goodman and others in the chats have alluded to, is the legal framework. Currently the only education pathway, and someone asked about this in the chat, to the US for a refugee student is through a student visa, primarily the F visa. And to get this visa, students need to prove that they don't intend to immigrate to the US, which is a really decisive barrier for many refugees who have difficulty proving that sometimes just by virtue of being refugees. And also once they're here, they have no clear permanent options to stay. Those options that are available for permanent status are quite limited and far from guaranteed. And then just lastly is the financial piece. As you all know, the US is a very expensive place to study, and there are quite limited scholarships available for displaced students. I'll leave it at that in the interest of time.
Thank you. Quick question for Alan, based on the last point. Given the political realities of the US today, is there any chance we can see significant movement in Washington on financial resources needed to address some of the issues at the scale that are needed? I mean, we saw some movement, and it'll be announced a little bit more even today on the legal front, but how about on the financial resources needed?
We're working at that every day. I think this strong bipartisan support in Congress for a program to help not only the Afghans, but other threatened students and scholars. Look for it in the FY23 budget.
Great. That's good news. Last question or questions for Susan. Global warming could double or triple the number of displaced people, so you and others are telling us. How should we begin to prepare and engage for that, if yet, or are there other things that are more important? And a little bit related to what we should focus on now. Should current efforts in higher ed be focused on actually higher ed, or is it more important to focus on the job training and employment, not really higher ed, because maybe the jobs aren't there? Two questions.
Okay, in terms of climate change, yes, there will be increased movements of people. A lot of that vast majority of it will be internal, not across border. And in the difference between refugees from particularly conflict and repression and climate migrants is that the governments generally of the countries in which there is climate migration will be interested in protecting their populace from it. And I think we'll be thinking more in terms of development programs, not emergency humanitarian programs, in dealing with that type of displacement and the way in which to support the governments in doing their job in protecting their own people. Where there is cross-border movements, though, it's likely to be into other poor countries. And in that case, there may need to be some humanitarian aid and help access to education through the mechanisms that are developed for refugees will, I think, be useful for this type of movement. And I'm sorry, Rick, what was the second question? It
had to do with sort of higher ed.
And what type?
Getting a PhD or on-the-job training, I guess.
Right. I think it's not an either or. I think we'll need both. The U.S. has benefited tremendously from bringing in higher educated or highly educated and continuing their education. Camp Kilmer was actually feeding ground for the Hungarian refugees to go back to school because so many of them were young, educated, or getting their education. And I think we need to be doing more and more of that. But at the same time, I think skills training is going to be essential, and things that don't necessarily result in a bachelor's or master's or PhD, but are very useful in terms of finding jobs and upgrading skills. And I think that's an area where community colleges are particularly important because they have already been the major way refugees learn English. And some levels of skills. And I think upping that as an entry point into not just, community college level, but also then for some to move up into the four-year college arrangements will be very important.
Excellent. Thank you all. Let's end it now so we can try to stay on schedule.